This is a sample lecture for a 300 or 400 level course entitled Frederick Douglass, Faith, the Constitution, and the Transformation of 19th Century America. The Axe Falls, Revivalism and the North-South Church Split 1844 and 1845. This lecture is meant to provide essential context for Frederick Douglass's powerful moral critique of Christianity in America. We need to consider the social and theological complexity at the intersection of slavery and evangelical faith after the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening was a period that profoundly changed the social and moral fabric of the country. In his narrative, Frederick Douglass doesn't just critique the cruelty of individual slave owners. He targets the very institutions that enabled the chattel slavery system. He found nothing more egregious than the religious hypocrisy of the slave system. He famously distinguishes between pure Christianity of Christ and the Christianity of this land. At one point he wrote, "I prayed for freedom for 20 years, but received no answer to my prayers until I prayed with my legs." The questions we face today as historians is how could American Christianity, a religion supposedly dedicated to morality, become the chief moral bulwark of chattel slavery? There is a schism that broke the Methodist and the Baptist churches in 1844 and 1845, demonstrating that faith divided the Union before politics did. It's a schizophrenic faith. The Second Awakening was fueled by a religious explosion of embracing revivalism and primitive religion. The Methodists and the Baptists would grow to become the largest denominations. These churches were democratic. They're decentralized. They appealed equally to the northern conscious and to the southern plantation owner. The churches turned against Calvinist theologies like predestination and towards what was considered to be a primitive or more biblical faith of conversion and demonstrating faith through morality. Theirs was a faith of free will and moral choice. In the North, this revivalism demanded immediatism, as in the immediate end of slavery. Slavery was an immediate sin that required instant repentance. They adopted a position of moral purity and rejecting old compromises with sin. So an old compromise was slavery. In the South, the ministers developed a theology of sanction. Under intense pressure, they declared the Bible supported slavery as a benevolent institution, that it Christianized and civilized the enslaved Africans. This allowed them to reconcile their faith and their very profitable economic system. The South, from the Old Testament, created an interpretation to enforce their white supremacist assumptions about African Americans. They used the curse of Ham, found in Genesis 9:20 through 27, and then to justify their white supremacist ideas. Then they used the examples of the patriarchs as slaveholders, and then the regulations in the Mosaic laws around slavery to support their economic system. From the New Testament, the Southerners concluded that seeing Jesus Christ and Paul didn't explicitly condemn the institution of slavery, and that Paul instructed slaves to be obedient to their masters twice, And then in Timothy, he instructed all who are under the yoke of slavery should consider their masters worthy of respect, that this master-slave relationship was therefore sanctified by Christianity. This comes to a time of crisis and split. This conflict, however, was not about the individual lay members. It was about the national organizations, the missionary boards, and the bishops. The Northern abolitionists demanded that these leaders be forced to emancipate any slaves they owned. The Methodist. The flashpoint for the Methodist was Bishop James O. Andrew of Georgia. James Osgood Andrew was the first native Georgian to be elected a bishop in the Methodist Church. He must have been a favorite son of Georgia. At the General Conference of 1844, the evolving abolitionist movement was taking hold, and they took the position that slavery was contrary to the principles of Methodism. They insisted that bishops not be permitted to own slaves. Recently ordained, Bishop Andrews becomes the focal point of this heated debate, and particularly in respect that he owned a slave named Kitty. Now, Kitty had been bequeathed to Andrew when she was 12, and the terms of her continued enslavement required that she be freed when she was 19 and sent to Liberia. This is part of what we see of the colonization schemes. There was a feel among white supremacists that the races could not live together and that interracial democracy could not happen. So the scheme was to send freed slaves, African Americans born here, to colonies in other parts of the world, in Africa, Liberia, or other places, South America, with some of the schemes. So we might make some assumptions about Bishop Andrew that he may have felt he was protecting Kitty. Sexual assault and abuse of slaves, particularly young women, was rampant in the system, and he may have felt he was protecting her. However, the Northern abolitionist ministers and bishops felt that a bishop could not hold a slave. So the conference voted 110 to 69 a resolution to pose him as bishop until his connection to slavery ended. The Southern clergy, who many were slave owners themselves, split. They framed this as an attack on private property rights, on their regional autonomy, and they rejected the Northern moral appeal. This deadlock collapsed the organization. The Southerners broke away and formed the Methodist Episcopal Church South. This organization would remain separate for 9 decades. This demonstrated that the Southerners prioritized in their institutional integrity, their regional customs, and over the moral demands of the abolitionists. Now, the Baptists, separate case in 1845, the Baptists, they followed the same pattern. Their Foreign Mission Board refused to appoint a slave owner as a missionary. The result was the formation of the Southern Baptist Convention, the SBC, as an explicit rejection of the national moral oversight of the convention and endorsement of the right of slaveholding. The problematic issue for us as historians is these churches prioritize property rights, they prioritize political peace and institutional unity over the foundational Christian principles of human dignity. By splitting, they officially and theologically sanctified white supremacy and the chattel slavery system. This validates Douglas's most visceral indictment, in which we now return to. I took upon the slaveholding clergyman not as a minister of Christ, but as a wolf in sheep's clothing. The splits were a powerful warning shot. They showed the entire nation that the bonds of religion, our strongest in cultural and spiritual bonds in the country, could not hold against the moral weight of chattel slavery. When the conflict came and reached the political parties later, the outcome of secession seemed inevitable at some point. We must remember that these events prove the moral choices have institutional consequences. Moral choices have consequences. The churches, in their effort to grow and unify a nation under a single revival tent, and ultimately tore that tent in two under the weight of slavery.